Welcome to the South Florida Roundup on WLRN. I'm Tom Hudson. Thanks for listening this week. On Monday, the Biden administration announced a lifting of some Trump-era sanctions placed on Cuba. It includes reviving the Cuban Family Reunification Parole Program and processing up to 20,000 immigration visas to the United States each year. Now, the State Department has said there are 22,000 applications that have not been acted upon in the past 5 years. Miami activist Nubis Rabina says members of her family have been stuck in immigration limbo for nearly 5 years due to some of the policies that are now being reversed.
Since 2017, they went on interviews, they got approved, they were waiting on their documents to travel, and all of a sudden everything got stopped and the documents are still stuck in Havana since 2017. Since then until today, we didn't know anything about this program. We didn't know if it was going to be restarted. We didn't know if it was going to be, taken away. So now we started to hear from this again.
And that change in policy followed a decision by the U.S. Treasury Department to allow direct American investment in a private Cuban business. Now, that hasn't happened since the Castro Revolution began 63 years ago. John Kavalik heads the U.S. Cuba Trade and Economic Council in New York. His application to invest in a Cuba private enterprise was okayed.
My thesis has always been the U.S. should be on the offensive and not give the Cuban government an excuse to say, well, you're not allowing it, so why should we? So now the U.S. has said, we're all in on this. Ball's in your court.
Yeah, the ball is in the Cuban government's court. The Cuban government still has to allow that investment for it to happen. But many Cuban exile leaders say the president's approach is flawed. Orlando Gutierrez Boronat heads the Assembly of the Cuban Resistance.
As long as the regime retains the kind of control it has, they will enrich themselves through those supposed independent businesses. So I think approaching the regime with a scalpel doesn't work. You got to hit them with a hammer.
All of these changes come as today, Friday, is the 120th anniversary of Cuban independence. Now, all of this happening as well because not only the Cuban policy that the Biden administration made changes to this week, but on Tuesday, the White House also lifted some sanctions on Venezuela, allowing Chevron to talk with Venezuelan state-owned oil monopoly and negotiate potential future activities in that country. So what does the easing of the sanctions mean for America's relationship with these countries and here in South Florida? What have politicians and those in the diaspora said about the moves from the Biden administration? How do they impact your family, your business, your community? Join our conversation here on the South Florida Roundup today on WLRN. Here's our phone number, 800-743-WLRN, 800-743-9576. You can also share your thoughts on Twitter. We're at WLRN. WLRN's America's editor, Tim Padget, is with us. So, Tim, lots to get into here, but first describe the changes to Cuban immigration.
Well, they're not so much changes as a resumption of policies that were effectively halted 5 years ago because of these alleged sonic attacks on U.S. embassy diplomats in Havana, as you'll recall. Mm-hmm. Now that the Biden administration feels it can start staffing the embassy again, it wants to resume policies, mainly that family reunification program that you mentioned, which allows U.S. citizens to get family members from Cuba, Cuban Americans who are U.S. citizens, to get family members relocated here in the U.S. So that and they can sort of circumvent a lot of the immigration visa requirements. And the second most important thing is ramping up the processing of those immigration visas in the U.S. Embassy.
Yeah, accelerating that process, which we just heard has been on hold for 5 years. Thousands have been backlogged. Is this the American response to the large increase in Cuban migrants on the U.S. southern border, as well as those that have been braving the Florida Straits?
Most definitely, yes. The Biden administration has really been thrown for a loop by this record wave of Cuban migrants coming, not so much, as is historically the case by water, arriving on our shores here in the Keys, but by land, arriving by the tens of thousands. Again, record wave at the U.S.'s southern border with Mexico.
What role, if any, in the U.S. reassessment of its Cuba policy did the street protests of last summer play?
Well, I think it played a lot. I think anything the U.S. does right now has a lot to do with those so-called Patria y Vida protests that happened last July, because it has raised the expectation of people, not just here in the exile community, but also on the island, that the U.S. is going to get behind that movement and try to push the Cuban regime to make changes. The big question, though, is what kind of change, what kind of policy does the U.S. undertake to start pushing the Cuban regime? The Trump administration's MO, of course, was retightening the screws on the regime. The Biden administration showed this week that it would like to go somewhat in a limited fashion back to the Obama administration approach of engaging at least the island economically so that we can see private entrepreneurs and other Cubans get some more economic empowerment.
Which leads us to the changes that the Biden administration announced regarding remittances back to the island. What were those?
Well, we don't know if the Biden administration wants to completely lift the ceiling that the Trump administration imposed on remittances, which was about $1,000 per quarter for Cubans here that they could send to families back on the island. But they do want to lift that ceiling that the Trump administration imposed. The main problem will be, at the same time, the Biden administration doesn't want any of that money to be touched by the military-led agency called FinCEMEX that takes a big cut of that remittance cash when it goes into Cuba. So it seems to believe now that the Cuban government is poised to drop its insistence that FinCEMEX be the agency that handles that remittances, and maybe we'll say a non-military agency entity now do that. The other big thing, though, about the remittances policy is that the Biden administration said that it wants to get a lot more remittance cash to Afro-Cubans who for years have been left out of the remittance scene.
Why identify that specific portion of the Cuban population?
Because one of the big purposes of remittance cash, getting that flow of money into Cuba, is not just to help, white, relatively more affluent families in Cuba, but you want to get that cash into the total bloodstream of the Cuban population. And that includes Cuban Americans. I think the White House pointed out to us that only 1 in 6 Afro-Cubans on the island have access to remittances from the U.S. So that sort of nullifies the whole intent of what that money is supposed to do in terms of empowering ordinary Cubans so that they're not so reliant on the big brother Cuban communist state.
Big changes announced by the Biden administration this week regarding its engagement with Cuba. 800-743-WLRN. This certainly has implications here in South Florida, in our community, our families, businesses, cultural institutions. We want to hear from you. 800-743-9576. 800-743-WLRN, as we're live here on this Friday afternoon on the South Florida Roundup. Luis Zuñiga is with us now. Luis is a member of the Assembly of the Cuban Resistance. Luis, thanks for sharing some of your time with us here today. What's your reaction to the changes announced this week?
Okay, thank you for the invitation and a great greeting for all the audiences. Well, indeed, some of the measures are understandable and others don't. The first one are about the issuance of more visas because thousands of Cubans has left the island and have gone to the United States, so it has overfulfilled the quota of 20,000 a year. Besides, that quota is a privilege for Cuban. We don't understand why, above other countries in Latin America, why is Cuba preferred? And second, the key issue that stop the working of immigration officers in Havana was the Havana Syndrome, that it has not been solved yet. As you know, tens of the U.S. diplomats have been injured, severely injured by what happened in Havana, that most experts, even civilian universities in the U.S., have qualified as a sonic attack on the diplomats, specifically on U.S. diplomats. So it has not been solved. It's still on. And I think that as long as the Cuban regime does not cooperate on the solving of this issue, the issuance of visa in Havana should not be continued.
Is there a solution to the wave of Cubans leaving the island, heading to the United States, a natural destination that you would support?
Oh, yes, indeed. Of course. Listen, the last administration imposed what the Cuban regime has qualified as the most dangerous and most damaging sanctions on Cuba. It's in the statement of the official statement of the Minister of Foreign Relations of Cuba last weekend. And at that time, there was no mass migration from Cuba. It did not happen. Then it came the mass protest in Havana 9 months ago, when the Cuban people perceived that the U.S. government was, in fact, confronting the dictatorship, that the U.S. was along with the Cuban people, supporting them, and they went out on the streets, rallying on the streets, protesting. Listen, the Cuban people was hungry, but the Cuban people rallying on the street did not call for food. The Cuban people needed medicine, and the people on the rallies did not request it for medicine. The Cuban people did not requested visas or exits from Cuba. They requested something quite different: freedom. That's what they claim. When the mass exodus came, when the regime implemented terror measures, incarcerating over 1,300 Cubans, including minors, and sentencing them to 10, 20, and even 30 years of prison just for protesting. And what happened next? Well, the regime immediately wanted the inside pressure against the regime to exhaust. And what they did? Well, they immediately called their friend in Nicaragua, or Daniel Ortega, a communist, to immediately say that Cubans may go to Nicaragua without a visa. What the Cubans need to go to Nicaragua for? To take a swimming in the Lake Managua Lake? Of course not. No. It was a plan. It was a plan for Cubans to live directly in Central America. And when the Cubans arrived in Managua airport, there were hundreds of mafia from Mexico taking them to the border of the United States just for $2,000-$3,000. So it was planned by the Cuban regime.
And Luis, we saw the results, certainly, of that with the thousands of Cubans arriving on the southern border of the United States, in addition to those that braved the Florida Straits. Let me bring another voice into our conversation here as we're talking about the Biden administration's changes to Cuba policy announced this week. Guena Rodriguez is with us, editor for 23 Flagler here in South Florida. Welcome back to WLRN. What are your reactions to these changes announced this week?
Thanks for the invite, Tom, and greetings to the audience and to Luis Zuñiga. I agree with Mr. Zuñiga that this was a move from the Cuban government to open up the Nicaragua path to the United States, and most likely because they had a lot of pressure within Cuba. I definitely agree with that. And I also agree that on the protests in July last year, people were asking for freedom. I believe that all freedom lovers Cubans, all democracy lovers Cubans would like to get rid of Cuban totalitarianism. I think that's a fact. But we also need to, we need to see on what are the U.S. policy that will strengthen the Cuban people so they can fight back against the regime.
Will the changes to the immigration, the reunification program do that in your estimation?
I think that goes through humanitarian goals. I don't think that the family reunification process will look at empower the people who is fighting within Cuba, but I think we can agree that families needs to be together. And we also have a problem within the United States. We have had several crises, migration crises from Cuba, and these visas come from agreements between the governments of Cuba and the United States decades ago to avoid precisely the illegal migration to the United States.
Let's talk about remittances here. Luis, the remittance policy that the Trump administration put in place was a hard and fast ceiling, a significant change compared to what the remittance allowances were previous to President Trump. There's some changes here that President Biden has been pushing for. What do you suggest for the remittance policy into Cuba for particularly the diaspora and the Miami community, the source of many of those remittances, to help Cuban family members, Cuban people, and colleagues on the island.
Yes, indeed. It is well known that over 60 or 65% of the Cuban people eat and have a life out of those remittances. They depend fundamentally on those remittances. It's a fact. The Cuban regime is a failed state. There is poverty all over, misery and scarcity, needs all over, because communism is a failure everywhere. In fact, the reason why the limit on remittances was implemented before was that most of those remittances were channeled through the military. And the military were forcing recipients of those remittances to buy on their stores, where prices were were extremely abusive.
Apologies for the interruption, Luis, but are there policies that you think would provide assistance to the Cuban people without running the risk of being siphoned by the Cuban government?
Yes, indeed. I admire that the president took into account that they cannot be funneled through Finitex, which is the financial enterprise of a regime. That's to be praised indeed from the administration. It's good to do that. As for the limit, the Cuban with $100 a month is enough for their needs. Anything else might be misused or might fall into the hands of a regime through the high prices they charge.
So you'd like to limit it at $100 per person in Cuba?
No, I don't. That's elastic. I am not adamant on the extent of the amount to be sent. Indeed, no.
Understood. Guena, how about this? How about to ensure that U.S. policies have the intended impact on the island, particularly as it comes to helping the dire economic straits that so many on the island find themselves in?
Yes, Tom, it depends. It depends on the implementation. Regarding remittances, I think there should be no limit, because even if there are limits from the United States side, people still send those money with, intermediary, with third people. And they pay a lot of money for that cash to reach their families. So they're going to be sending money regardless. And many times the people who charges them skyrocket, prices for taking the money are most likely related to the regime. So I think it's a bad idea anyhow, just to limit remittances. And, we have been trying all these sanctions for a lot of years, for 30 years. And people say, hey, Biden asked nothing in return. I disagree. The American people, through the Helms-Burton Act, the American people has been making demands for the Cuban regime for democracy, for general elections, multi-parties, the regime has not felt the need to make those changes.
So, the complaint, though, Gennady, is that the Biden administration and previously the Obama administration offered branches to and instituted significant policy changes, easing sanctions and easing relations without receiving something in return from the communist government.
I disagree. I believe that the implementation of public internet came directly from the Obama negotiations. And we have protests last year because there was internet in the island. So it was a huge impact. However, what was important was to change the dynamic. The United States was seen as the enemy, and they blamed everything that was going on within the island on the United States. But Obama came to be even more popular than Castro's in Cuba. I just talked to a Cuban yesterday, and he said that if Obama had run for president in Cuba, most likely he will have, he won that election. And, stimulating the imagination.
I can hear the critics already talk about whether or not that's a free and fair election on the island. First, you have to have the democratic institutions in place. But we got a lot to talk about. And one other significant piece, gentlemen, of the changes that were announced this week regard travel. Of course, that was kind of the centerpiece of the Obama engagement. That was really limited and peeled back during the Trump administration. Tim, what were some of the changes here that the Biden administration wants to make?
Well, travel is also an economic issue, in this context. And the two big changes were, one, they would resume flights from the U.S. into Cuba into cities other than just Havana. As you'll recall, the Trump administration had restricted things to just Havana. Now you can take flights from the U.S. back into the interior, which is a lot of families here agree with, because it's very hard to get around the interior of Cuba if you can only fly into Havana. The second big one was that they will resume group people-to-people exchange travel for educational and other purposes like that. Not individual, but group.
But yet still a big classification of travel potentially for Americans to visit the island.
And that matters, as I said, economically, because you've got dollar-toting Americans coming in to help private businesses, in theory.
Luis, your response to this restarting of flights from the United States into locations in Cuba other than Havana. Do you think that will help spread some economic activity?
No, I think that's just for family visits. What is benefiting, and I have no objection to that. That's a humanitarian, and I do not oppose any measure concerning the humanitarian issue, because that's needed for the Cuban. What I oppose is the exchange, again, the academic and visitors exchanges of groups that we have learned quite completely that those are tourism, hidden tourism, disguised tourism. It has been the history of all that. The same thing that happened with cruise ships. Cruise ships were providing $300 million to the regime, to the military organizations that control tourism, and the Cuban people got nothing in return. The cuenta propistas, the small license holders in Cuba for services, they were set aside from those opportunities. Besides, the Clinton administration implemented those people-to-people contact, and it was a failure. It's a failed experience that should not be repeated, because it's used as a hidden way of tourism.
Yeah, we should point out, of course, cruise ships are not part of the announcement from the Biden administration. This is regarding air travel from the United States to cities in Cuba other than Havana. Gennady, what do you make of this potential easing of some of the travel restrictions?
I think, of course, it has political risks. But I prefer people and Americans going to Cuba, interacting with Cubans, and try to bringing good information to these people who are going to the island, instead of having a North Korea just in the south of U.S. frontier. We don't want either to have such an isolated country that even people in Cuba are having trouble to interact with, democratic minds such as the United States.
Finally, I'd like to hear from all three of you on this. What about political implications for President Biden? This announcement happening, as we noted, just days before the 120th anniversary of Cuban independence, but also happening here in a midterm election year. Luis, do you think there will be any political implication or calculation involved?
Oh, yes, indeed.
American political calculation is what I'm asking about.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, because most communities, Cuban Americans, Venezuelan Americans, Nicaraguan Americans, and all other nationalities that are in the risk that their country falls under communism, they are angry with the measures any measure that may ease the situation of a dictatorship, and they know that Cuba is the cancer. Cuba is responsible for all this spread of communism in the Americas. So I think that it will hurt the Democrats in the next elections in November. I think that it will hurt them.
Gennady, what's your analysis of the American political implications of some of these changes?
Yeah, most likely, Cuban American voters who do not agree with any kind of reapproachment to Cuba will vote and will punish in the elections to Democrats. But I think they have a broader problem. They have a deep immigration crisis with Cuba, and they have to solve it anyhow. And that will, if that crisis continues deepening, that will compromise them with a broader electorate in the United States, not just the Cuban Americans. Also, I have to say that even though there is a majority of Cuban Americans, about probably 60%, given last polls that I have seen, that might disagree with this approach, there is also another minority of Cuban Americans, about probably 35 or 36, who does agree with this, what President is doing. And for them, it makes perfect sense to go back to Cuba and somehow trying to strengthen, give resources to the people and see if we can change that dynamic that have kept that totalitarianism for several decades in Cuba.
Tim, when you have received some background briefings on these changes, politics come up at all?
No, but the let's just say the sotto voce implication here is I don't think you can discount the reality that the Biden administration looks at Florida, particularly South Florida, and has decided that this is red now, not purple even. It's red. And I think they have all but written off, particularly South Florida, as an electoral scene that they can really impact anymore. And so I think it actually sort of frees them up to take decisions like they did this week.
Tim Padget is the Americas editor here at WRLN. Luis Zuñiga is a member of the Assembly of the Cuban Resistance. And Guena Rodriguez is editor for 23 y Flagler. To all three of you, thanks for sharing your perspectives and reporting with us. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.